Hey folks, this is Kalani. Shadowlands might just end up being the best expansion we've ever seen, and it's not just because the zones are pretty and the systems seem like a lot of fun. I think one of the key factors in this expansion's progression and development, and hopefully success, is how open and communicative the development team has been. There's an actual conversation going back and forth this time. Feedback has been taken seriously, and we've had so many community interviews with members of the dev team. Preach was just able to interview Morgan Day, the lead encounter designer for World of Warcraft, so you know this one is going to be a good one. We have info on class changes, covenant updates, dungeon info, Torghast testing, and some cool tidbits on how the team is approaching Shadowlands. Before we get stuck in, be sure to pop by our live stream over at twitch.tv/KalaniTV. We have cats, we have cameras, and we're not afraid to use them for maximum cuteness. We'll also be testing Shadowlands too if the cats didn't already get your attention. Now, perhaps the most important information that came out of this interview was the little chat about class changes. Shadow Priest was brought up very specifically because a lot of Shadow Priests just aren't happy with how the spec is shaping up as a whole, which is a pretty big deal when it's your only DPS spec you can actually play with. The response was kind of interesting. There aren't any plans on the table right now to look at Shadow Priest, or at least there are no solid reworks waiting in the wings, but they also didn't say they were going to completely write off more class changes. Shadow Priest specifically is on their radar. The actual answer is a bit more complex. On the alpha right now we have access to very little in terms of endgame systems and features. Imagine right now if you take your BFA characters and take away their Azerite traits, essences, and corruption. You're not really left with much most of the time. That's what Shadowlands Alpha is right now. We don't have full control over the Covenant abilities, and we haven't even seen 2 out of the 4 Covenant zones or any of their abilities in game. There's also soulbinds, conduits, and legendary effects to add into the mix, and we haven't seen any of these whatsoever. So the answer isn't necessarily that no more class changes will happen. The answer is, we're going to wait until we get these major features and effects into your hands first, see how that all plays out, and then go from there. If they still need to make large changes even with all of those systems adding to your gameplay, then there's a pretty big problem that they definitely want to address. They also mentioned that getting these systems into our hands for testing is a top priority, which means we should hopefully see them on the alpha within the next month or so. I know they wanted to get Torghast in as quickly as possible for the same reason, to get some hands-on time with that feature, so they're definitely looking for and listening to feedback. And they are currently of the mindset that the earlier is better when it comes to getting feedback on major systems in this expansion. That's very different from their attitude in BFA, where we saw Azerite traits incredibly late in the beta cycle, so it's definitely nice to see the opposite of that for Shadowlands. Earlier testing means more feedback and, more importantly, extra time for iteration and changes if they need to be made. The main takeaway from this is that hope is not lost for class changes. They might happen if a spec or class still doesn't feel good after it gains access to the various temporary powers that we will have in Shadowlands. I still think a spec or class should be able to stand up on its own and be fun without temporary powers, but I guess we might have to wait for yet another expansion for that to happen. I'm still really excited about all the gear changes coming to Shadowlands for no RNG gear and all that jazz, so I still think it would be a net win. Let's just hope they have enough time left to make class changes if they really need to. Now, you may be thinking, oh great, more temporary powers, it's going to be BFA all over again. Well, sort of. Maybe. But probably not really. Yes, we have more temporary powers. Yes, they will probably disappear again at the end of the Shadowlands expansion, but there is one key difference here. If you remember back to the start of BFA, we only started with Azerite traits, and kind of bad ones at that. Does anyone else remember Thunderous Blast? That was like the best DPS trait you could get, and it was incredibly boring. Oftentimes the passives were the better ones, and even if you didn't have a completely boring passive that just dealt extra damage sometimes, the traits you had probably didn't really change anything. They were boring and they still didn't really do much. That wasn't quite enough, so when 8.1 rolls in, we got more Azerite traits. Still not really enough. 8.2 introduced Heart of Azeroth essences, which was a bit better but still didn't compare to what we had in Legion, and then 8.3 brought in Corruption to just flip the table completely on gearing. The difference between BFA temporary powers and Shadowlands temporary powers is that we were given BFA powers over the course of an entire expansion. A year and a half at this point. We were patched up bit by bit, and it was kind of poor patching to say the least. We still got a few holes here and there. For Shadowlands, we'll have 2 Covenant abilities that you choose, Soulbinds to go along with those covenants that you choose and customize and can swap around, conduits to empower certain aspects of your Soulbinds, and legendary effects from the new legendary crafting system. The dev said in this interview that chances are we will have those covenant abilities, we'll be happily progressing through and earning bonuses from the Soulbinds and conduits, and we will probably have our first legendary item all before the first raid opens up. So we're getting all of these features and systems right from the get-go, which means they should hopefully plug most holes that are left in classes and specs. I'm not saying it's perfect, I'm not saying it's ideal, but I do think it's going to be much more enjoyable than just having some rather uninteresting Azerite traits like we did for the start of BFA. It's good to know that we should have at least 1 legendary under our belt in the first few weeks of the expansion launching too. I can't wait to see more of this legendary crafting system. While we don't have too much info about legendary crafting, Morgan did mention that they're looking to anima powers to maybe include some of those as legendary effects. Think about that for a second. We have crazy stuff like your damage increase for every totem you have out, Healing Stream totem provides damage reduction, Blink has no cooldown, Invisibility makes your next Frostbolt, Fireball or Arcane Blast hit for 2000% more damage. These are some broken anima powers, and there are a lot of them in here for sure. They did say that the numbers would be tuned down to be semi-realistic for out in the world, but some of the actual effects could make it into the pool of legendary powers you can attach to your crafted legendary gear. That is super interesting for a few reasons. The first is that we might see a lot of different legendary effects. We might have a very deep pool to choose from here, which is pretty exciting, but another reason is that they can actually test effects in Torghast. There are no limits in Torghast. You can go crazy and break the game. That's kind of half the point, but if an effect is particularly fun to use, even if its effectiveness is reduced, they could test some of these new effects in Torghast and say, alright, cool, everyone likes this one, ship that over to the Legendary Forge and let people add it to their legendaries. It's almost like a free testing ground, but it's not just for legendary effects. Preach brought up an incredibly awesome idea. Use Torghast to test mechanics, class changes, honestly anything. It's the perfect sandbox. If you want to make a boss do something weird, throw that weird ability on a Torghast boss first and see how it pans out. If people hate it, scrap it. If people love it, add it in a dungeon or raid later on. Torghast has so much potential. I hope the dev team makes the most out of it. Another question that crops up again and again is, how will Torghast work? Can we enter this amazing tower endlessly? How is loot going to work in a dungeon that never ends? And we finally have a bit of a clearer answer. Obviously this is still subject to change, a work in progress, and everything else. Alpha is alpha, but the idea of separating endless Torghast from loot Torghast was brought up in the interview. So maybe you would hop into Torghast for the legendary crafting materials, and that version of the tower would maybe only take you 30 to 40 minutes and you get what you need. It's more bite-sized Torghast, but it will also require some form of key. So you'll need to take part in other types of content to gain access to Torghast, similar to how you do dailies and stuff to be able to take part in Horrific Visions right now in BFA. So that section of Torghast where you'll get the legendary crafting materials that everyone will want to get their hands on, let's be honest, it's going to be more or less mandatory or forced content because who doesn't want a legendary? That type of run will be restricted in one form or another, but then there's the potential to open up Torghast without the legendary loot and have it be unlimited tries, and as endless as the dev team can make it, and that kind of run would have no restrictions based on entering it, just a free roam Torghast to spend your spare time. The rewards would be different, more cosmetic than anything else, but at least you'll be allowed to climb the tower to your heart's content. I think that might end up being a fantastic middle ground for a lot of players, so it's exciting to hear that they're thinking that could be an option. There is some other Torghast news real quick before we move on. Every class except Rogue and Paladin will be available for testing in Torghast in the next build, unless something drastic changes, which will apparently, by the way, go up sometime today or tomorrow. So if you want to see us explore Torghast on the new classes live, pop on over to twitch.tv/KalaniTV. Links in the description and comments below. The other super cool thing is that all of the Covenant abilities will also be turned on for testing. So even though the Ardenweald and Maldraxxus zones aren't available for testing yet, apparently they're not ready, they want to start testing the Covenant abilities in Torghast because the abilities themselves are ready. So they're going to start rotating the Covenant abilities that you get for Torghast through all 4 sets. So one day you'll get the Kyrian stuff, the next day might be Necrolord, the day after that might be Revendreth, and then the day after could be Ardenweald, and then it resets. So they'll enable every Covenant ability for all of the classes where it's ready for testing one after another to get as much feedback as possible. This is really going to spice up Torghast again, and you should be able to get a really good look at how your class is shaping up, and more classes added to the roster is always a lot of fun because we get to see what new crazy anima powers we get to play with. The rogues and paladins will have to wait just a teeny bit longer sadly, but hopefully they'll get in as well soon. The temporary powers also tie into another question that was asked in the interview, and a question that has been asked time and time again by the community. How's that Covenant swapping thing coming along? Can we swap yet? Do we still get locked in? What we got? We don't have any solid info on this just yet, nothing new at any rate, but what we were told is basically the soulbinds and conduits will work to balance the Covenant abilities, and they can add those in almost whenever they want. So, if you're a Warlock, this was the example given, and your Covenant ability is strictly single target, they can then add in an AoE option to the Soulbinds to balance it out. On the flip side, if your Covenant is AoE based, they can add in a single target Soulbind to balance that out. Soulbinds are also Covenant specific, so you'll be choosing more than just your Covenant ability when you pick a Covenant. The Soulbinds you have access to could vary quite drastically as well. We need to see the bigger picture before we can really draw up a fair conclusion. It might turn out that the Covenant as a rounded, big picture with everything included ends up being fairly balanced, even if the individual Covenant abilities are not, if that makes sense. We're not going to get a good look at this until everything's available, but hopefully we will see these systems on Alpha sometime soon. And that's all the big news we got out of today's interview. Expect a new build later today or tomorrow with all sorts of exciting new stuff, but that's it for this video. What do you think of the anima powers potentially becoming legendary effects? Are you still worried about Covenant abilities and balancing, even though there's more to Covenants than just those 2 abilities? Leave all your thoughts in the comment section below. If you want to explore the alpha alongside us, you can catch us live over at twitch.tv/KalaniTV. We'll be going live later today around 12 PM PST for some new build hype, so drop by and say hi. A big thank you to all of our supporters over on Patreon and our subscribers on Twitch. You can see their names floating by on screen. If you want to join these lovely guys and gals, you can find a link in the description below. Remember to leave a like just below the video before you leave, and if you want to see more, make sure to subscribe. But apart from that, thanks for watching folks, good luck and have fun, and as always I will see you next time.